Ben Vice reporting there. Now, joining us from Westminster, we've got two of our MPs, Lloyd Russell-Moyle, the Labour MP for Brighton Kemp Town, and also Maria Caulfield, who's the Tory MP for Lewes. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us on the programme this evening. Let's start with you, Maria. How do you sum up this year's speech? How did it feel for you?
Well, I think, obviously Brexit is the main focus, and that's what featured heavily in the Queen's speech. And there's going to be 8 separate bills to deal with Brexit. And I, particularly with my constituency of Lewes, having the Port of Newhaven welcome the deal on fishing, but also for farming. I've got a big farming community, and I know during the election that many of them were very nervous about what the future holds for farmers. And hopefully with this bill, that will give them some certainty going forward. So I think while domestically it was probably lighter on legislation, I think we all recognise that the next 2 years are really going to be quite heavily focused on Brexit.
And of course, Maria, an awful lot of focus on what wasn't in there. A lot of what was in the manifesto wasn't in the Queen's speech.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's recognised, that the manifesto was disappointing for many. I know, speaking to people on the doorstep, that they didn't want to see the removal of the triple lock, they didn't want to see the end of free school meals, and I think the Queen's speech reflects what the concerns were raised on the doorsteps.
Let's bring Lloyd Russell-Moyle into this. Lloyd, what did you make of the speech?
Well, I made of it that it was threadbare in what it contained. It had to drop vast swathes of the Conservative manifesto, but in recognition, Maria's right, that they lost this election. No one won this election, but I think even on some of the domestic policies, there were nice plaudits, but the content was weak. Saying that we will make sure that there is a fairer funding formula for our schools is what has been said by this government for the last year or 2 years with the changing of funding formula. It hasn't happened. So unless there's some meat on the bones, I'm yet very sceptical of some of the suggestions. Of course, there are things that we welcome. The stuff around domestic violence victims and victims of abuse not being able to be cross-examined in court, the stuff around letting fees. But the reality is it's a bit too little too late. We need to talk about building millions of more council homes. We need to make sure there is money to make sure our tower blocks are safe. No agreement on money, no agreement on actually lifting the cap for council building. So actually, yeah, again, nice words, but all a bit too weak, all a bit too little, all a bit too late.
Maria, some interesting points raised there, particularly on the subject of schools. I mean, today, for instance, I had an email from both two schools locally that my children go to, very concerned about funding, and this has been an ongoing issue.
Absolutely, and since I was elected 2 years ago, it's been an issue. And in my schools, which are in East Sussex, the funding formula there for decades has underfunded schools in East Sussex, and I was hoping that the fairer funding formula that was announced earlier this year would address that, and it didn't. And I came out very strongly to say that my schools needed more funding. It wasn't enough just to increase the funding. They actually needed the funding per head per pupil to deliver, the resources they needed, because some of my schools are letting staff go, and I've been very vocal on that. And Lloyd is right, we need to see the detail of that, and we need to see the figures behind that, because I won't support any legislation that will actually see my schools worse off.
And that's really good to hear, Maria. When was the last time you voted against the government, say, for example, on an education matter?
Well, there haven't been any votes on an education matter during the last part. There wasn't actually on the fairer funding formula. It was a consultation which ended just before the election, and I made it very clear that if the figures that were put in that consultation were the ones carried through to a vote, I couldn't support it, and that's my pledge. Remains the same to my schools and my constituency.
Let's just finish by asking you both, what does a successful customs deal look like? Let's start with you, Lloyd.
A successful customs deal means that we do not reintroduce custom border checks. It means that we are part of the customs union or equivalency, and it means that our businesses, including farmers and fishermen who Maria has mentioned, are able to trade without having to go through additional burdens of checks and requirements. That's what it needs to look like. It needs to be effectively a member of the customs union or thereabouts equivalent. Talking about setting up more customs checks, I'm not sure is the way forward.
Maria?
Well, in terms of the customs union, what I want to see from the Brexit negotiations is us actually leaving the current EU customs union, because what that means is that we will then be able to trade more freely with countries outside of the EU. And I think we've missed a trick over many, many years as other economies have emerged, of not being able to trade freely without tariffs and barriers with those other countries. So I'm optimistic that what's in the Queen's speech will enable that to happen. That doesn't mean that we stop trading with the EU. It doesn't mean that we can't have a free trade agreement with the EU, but being in the customs union is the one thing that really restricts us from doing trade outside.
Well, it doesn't in the sense that the EU is able to negotiate as part of a bigger bloc, and it is very successful in negotiating quality agreements rather than just race to the bottom agreements.
I can see there's a lot of debate ahead. Thank you both very much for joining us on the programme. Maria Caulfield and Lloyd Russell Moyle, who are two of our MPs, Labour MP for Brighton Kemp Town, Lloyd Russell Moyle, and Maria Caulfield, who's the Tory MP for Lewis. The time now coming up to 27 minutes past 5.